long before it became the subject of worldwide prohibition, before it was demonized in propaganda films, and before it sparked a cultural revolution, marijuana was simply a plant. But this is no ordinary plant. Its story stretches back thousands of years, weaving through ancient civilizations, medieval medicine, colonial empires, and modern politics. This is the complete history of cannabis, the world's most wanted drug. Our story begins over 10,000 years ago in the steppes of Central Asia, where early humans first encountered wild cannabis plants. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannabis was one of humanity's first agricultural crops, cultivated not for getting high, but for its incredibly versatile fibers. These ancient peoples discovered that cannabis stalks could be processed into rope, textiles, and paper. The seeds provided nutrition, rich in protein and essential fatty acids. But they also noticed something else about this remarkable plant. The earliest recorded use of cannabis as a psychoactive substance dates back to around 2700 BCE in ancient China. Emperor Shen Nung, considered the father of Chinese medicine, documented cannabis in his pharmacopoeia, recommending it for conditions ranging from malaria to rheumatism. The Chinese called it ma, and they understood it had both healing and mind-altering properties. They used it cautiously, primarily as medicine, but were well aware of its intoxicating effects. From China, cannabis spread along the ancient trade routes. It travelled south into India, where it became deeply embedded in spiritual and religious practices. In Hindu tradition, cannabis was considered a gift from the god Shiva. Legend says that after a family argument, Shiva wandered into the fields and fell asleep under a cannabis plant. When he woke and ate some of its leaves, he felt so refreshed that cannabis became his favourite food, earning him the title Lord of Bhang. Indian society developed three main preparations: bhang, a drink made from leaves and flowers; ganja, made from the flowering tops; and charas, a form of hashish. These weren't just recreational substances, they were integral to religious ceremonies, meditation practices, and Ayurvedic medicine. Meanwhile, in the ancient Middle East, cannabis found its way into Scythian culture. These nomadic warriors, who roamed the steppes from modern-day Ukraine to Mongolia, used cannabis in funeral rites. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described how Scythians would create vapor baths by throwing cannabis seeds onto heated stones inside small tents. They would inhale the vapors and, as Herodotus put it, howl with pleasure. Archaeological excavations have confirmed this practice, finding charred cannabis seeds and even golden cups containing traces of cannabis and opium in Scythian burial mounds. The ancient world was surprisingly sophisticated in its understanding of cannabis. Egyptian mummies have been found with traces of cannabis in their systems. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia mention a plant called azalu that scholars believe was cannabis. It was used for everything from easing childbirth to treating depression. The ancient world saw cannabis as a valuable tool, a plant of both practical and mystical significance. As we move into the medieval period, cannabis continued its journey westward. Islamic scholars, building on earlier Greek and Roman medical knowledge, extensively documented cannabis's medicinal properties. Physicians like Avicenna included detailed descriptions of cannabis in their medical encyclopedias. The plant was recommended for headaches, inflammation, and various other ailments. Importantly, while Islam prohibited alcohol, cannabis occupied a more ambiguous space, with different Islamic societies taking different approaches to its use. In medieval Europe, cannabis was primarily known as hemp, valued almost exclusively for its fibre. The Vikings used hemp ropes on their longships. Medieval farmers grew it for textiles. It was an essential crop for any maritime power because hemp fibre was superior to any alternative for making the ropes and sails that powered naval vessels. But Europeans remained largely unaware of cannabis's psychoactive properties. That knowledge remained concentrated in Asia and the Middle East. The Renaissance and Age of Exploration changed everything. European colonizers encountered cannabis in its various forms across the globe. Spanish conquistadors found indigenous peoples in the Americas using psychoactive plants, though not cannabis initially, as it wasn't native to the Americas. However, European colonizers soon brought cannabis to the New World, specifically for hemp production. Hemp became a crucial crop in colonial America. Farmers were actually required by law to grow it in some colonies. The fibre was essential for rope, sails, and clothing. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both grew hemp on their plantations, and there's evidence in their writings that they were aware of the differences between hemp grown for fibre and cannabis cultivated for its medicinal or psychoactive properties. The 19th century marked a turning point. This was when Western medicine began seriously investigating cannabis. An Irish physician named William O'Shaughnessy, working in India in the 1830s, conducted extensive research on cannabis's medical applications. He experimented with cannabis extracts to treat muscle spasms, pain, and nausea. When he returned to Europe, he brought cannabis with him, introducing it to Western medical practice. By the mid-1800s, cannabis extracts were available in pharmacies throughout Europe and America. It was prescribed for dozens of conditions: insomnia, pain, inflammation, anxiety, and more. Major pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly and Park Davis sold cannabis preparations. It was as legitimate as aspirin or any other medicine of the era. This was also the period when Europeans and Americans began encountering cannabis as an intoxicant rather than just medicine or fibre. French intellectuals and artists, including Charles Baudelaire and Alexandre Dumas, formed the Club des Hachishins in Paris in the 1840s. They met regularly to consume hashish, often in elaborate preparations mixed with honey, nuts, and spices. They documented their experiences, writing about the drug's effects on creativity and perception. This was cannabis as a recreational and exploratory substance used by the cultural elite. But while intellectuals experimented, cannabis was also making its way into different social contexts. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, significant migration brought cannabis into new communities. Indian and Caribbean workers brought cannabis smoking traditions to various parts of the British Empire. Mexican immigration to the United States brought marijuana, as it came to be called from the Mexican-Spanish term. These working-class communities used cannabis much as they might use alcohol for relaxation and socializing. This is where our story takes a dark turn. The early 20th century saw the rise of drug prohibition movements initially focused on opium and cocaine. These movements were often intertwined with racism and xenophobia. In the United States, early anti-cannabis laws were explicitly tied to racial prejudice. In the Southwest, local laws against marijuana were passed alongside efforts to control Mexican immigration. Police and newspapers claimed that marijuana made Mexican immigrants violent and criminal. Similar racist rhetoric was directed at Black Americans, with claims that marijuana use among black jazz musicians led to violence and, particularly inflammatory, relationships with white women. The man who would nationalize this prohibition was Harry Anslinger, appointed head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. Anslinger was a zealous prohibitionist who saw marijuana as a scourge that needed to be eliminated. He launched a propaganda campaign that was stunning in its dishonesty and racism. Anslinger made outrageous claims. Marijuana caused insanity. It turned people into violent criminals. It was responsible for murders and sexual assaults. He collected newspaper clippings about crimes, often with no actual connection to marijuana, and created what he called his gore files, which he used to terrify politicians and the public. His campaign culminated in the 1936 propaganda film Reefer Madness, originally titled Tell Your Children. This film depicted marijuana users as deranged, violent maniacs who descended into madness, murder, and suicide after just a few puffs. It was absurd, hysterical, and completely divorced from reality. But it was effective. In 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which didn't technically ban cannabis, but imposed such severe regulations and taxes that it effectively criminalized it. Remarkably, the American Medical Association opposed this law, arguing that cannabis had legitimate medical uses and that there was no scientific basis for prohibition. They were ignored. The Second World War briefly interrupted prohibition. Suddenly, with supply lines to Asian hemp producers cut off, the US government desperately needed hemp for the war effort. The same government that had been demonizing cannabis launched the Hemp for Victory campaign, encouraging farmers to grow hemp and even providing seeds and equipment. Over 150,000 acres of hemp were cultivated for the war, but as soon as the war ended, prohibition resumed with renewed vigor. The 1950s saw increasingly harsh penalties for marijuana offenses. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced, with first-time possession potentially resulting in years in prison. The Boggs Act of 1952 and the Narcotics Control Act of 1956 established mandatory sentences for drug offenses, treating marijuana the same as heroin. A first offense could bring 2 to 10 years in prison. These laws reflected the Cold War paranoia of the era, with drugs seen as tools of communist subversion, weakening American youth and society. Then came the 1960s, and everything changed. Cannabis moved from the margins of society to the mainstream of youth culture. The counterculture movement adopted marijuana as a symbol of rebellion against conservative values and the Vietnam War. College students, middle-class white kids, were now smoking marijuana in huge numbers. Suddenly, the drug that had been associated primarily with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians was everywhere. Icons like Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and countless others openly discussed their cannabis use. The war on marijuana was now targeting the children of the middle class, not just marginalized communities. This created a crisis for prohibitionists. How could they justify imprisoning middle-class white kids for smoking marijuana? President Nixon had an answer, and it was cynical in the extreme. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, later admitted in an interview that the Nixon administration's war on drugs was explicitly designed as a political weapon. He explained that the Nixon White House couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or to be black, but by declaring a war on drugs and heavily criminalizing marijuana and heroin, they could disrupt both the anti-war left and black communities. They could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the news. Ehrlichman admitted they knew they were lying about the dangers of marijuana, but it was politically useful. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which classified drugs into 5 schedules based on their medical value and potential for abuse. Despite a commission Nixon himself appointed, the Schaefer Commission, which concluded that marijuana should be decriminalized and that the penalties were more harmful than the drug itself, marijuana was placed in Schedule 1. This classification meant the government considered marijuana to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, the same category as heroin. It was and remains a classification unsupported by science. The war on drugs escalated dramatically under President Reagan in the 1980s. Just Say No became a national campaign. mandatory minimum sentencing was expanded. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established severe penalties for drug offences. Crack cocaine got most of the attention, but marijuana arrests soared. Millions of Americans were arrested for simple possession. Families were destroyed. Young people, disproportionately young Black and Latino men despite similar usage rates across racial groups, received criminal records that would follow them for life, limiting their employment, education, and housing opportunities. The 1980s also saw increased awareness of marijuana's medical potential. AIDS patients discovered that marijuana helped with pain, nausea from medications, and appetite loss. Cancer patients found the same benefits. Activists, particularly in the AIDS community, began pushing for medical marijuana access. This was compassion versus prohibition, sick people versus the government, and public opinion began to shift. In 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, legalizing medical marijuana. It was a watershed moment, the first crack in the wall of prohibition. The federal government was furious. Federal raids on medical marijuana dispensaries continued even in states where it was legal. But the momentum had shifted. Other states began following California's lead. By the early 2000s, multiple states had medical marijuana programs. The scientific case against prohibition was also becoming undeniable. Research, despite significant federal obstacles, was revealing cannabis's medical potential. Studies showed effectiveness for chronic pain, nausea, muscle spasms, seizures, and other conditions. The discovery of the endocannabinoid system, a biological system in the human body with which cannabis compounds interact, revolutionized our understanding. Humans have receptors specifically for cannabinoids because our bodies naturally produce similar compounds. This wasn't a foreign poison, it was a plant that interacted with our biology in complex ways. The 2000s and 2010s saw accelerating change. More states legalized medical marijuana. Attitudes shifted dramatically, especially among younger generations. The racial injustice of marijuana prohibition became impossible to ignore. Despite similar usage rates, Black Americans were nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white Americans. The war on marijuana was destroying lives, costing billions of dollars, and accomplishing nothing positive. In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize recreational marijuana for adults. It was revolutionary. Voters decided that marijuana should be treated more like alcohol, regulated and taxed, but legal for adult use. The sky didn't fall. Crime didn't skyrocket. Teenagers didn't start using marijuana at higher rates. Instead, states generated tax revenue, jobs were created, and thousands of people were no longer being arrested and imprisoned for a plant. The movement spread. Oregon, Alaska, California, Nevada, Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, Michigan, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Virginia, New Mexico, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Montana, Arizona, and more legalized recreational marijuana. Canada legalized it nationwide in 2018. Uruguay had done so in 2013. Mexico moved toward legalization. The international prohibition consensus was crumbling. But this isn't a simple happy ending. Federal prohibition remains in the United States. Marijuana is still Schedule Y. This creates ongoing conflicts between state and federal law. People can still be denied federal employment, housing, or benefits for marijuana use even in legal states. International drug treaties still classify cannabis alongside the most dangerous drugs. Many countries maintain harsh prohibition with severe criminal penalties. The legacy of prohibition is also still with us. Millions of people have criminal records for marijuana offences. Many are still imprisoned for crimes that are no longer crimes in their states. The communities most harmed by prohibition, particularly Black and Latino communities, have often been shut out of the legal marijuana industry by high startup costs and licensing barriers. The war on marijuana may be ending in some places, but its casualties remain. Today's marijuana industry is a strange hybrid of counterculture roots and corporate capitalism. Dispensaries range from medical clinics to boutique shops selling premium products with sophisticated branding. Cannabis has been bred into thousands of strains with different effects, flavors, and potencies. CBD, a non-intoxicating component of cannabis, has become a mainstream wellness product. Cannabis is used not just for recreation, but for anxiety, sleep, pain, inflammation, and dozens of other purposes, sometimes with strong scientific support, sometimes with more hope than evidence. The plant itself has been transformed by selective breeding. Ancient cannabis likely contained modest levels of THC, the primary psychoactive compound. Modern strains can contain 20, 25, even 30% THC or more. High-potency concentrates, extracts, and edibles can deliver enormous doses. This has raised legitimate questions about safety, particularly for young people, heavy users, and those predisposed to mental health issues. While marijuana is far safer than the propaganda claimed, it's not without risks. Heavy use, especially of high-potency products and especially starting in adolescence, has been associated with mental health concerns, motivation issues, and in vulnerable individuals, psychosis. The legalization movement has also had to grapple with difficult questions. How do we regulate marijuana? What age should be the minimum? How do we prevent driving under the influence? How do we keep marijuana away from children while making it accessible to adults? What do we do about edibles that might appeal to kids? How do we address workplace drug testing? How do we help communities harmed by prohibition participate in the legal industry? These aren't simple questions, and different jurisdictions have answered them differently. Internationally, the picture is complex and rapidly evolving. The Netherlands has famously tolerated cannabis sales in coffee shops since the 1970s, though technically it remains illegal. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, treating drug use as a health issue rather than a criminal one, with remarkable success in reducing addiction and overdoses. Spain allows cannabis social clubs. Germany recently moved toward legalization. Thailand legalized medical marijuana and has taken steps toward broader legalization. But other countries maintain extreme prohibition. In some nations, marijuana possession can result in death penalties. In others, long prison sentences remain common. Singapore, Indonesia, China, and many Middle Eastern countries maintain zero-tolerance policies with severe consequences. The global drug policy conversation has fundamentally shifted, though. The United Nations, once the architect of international drug prohibition, has acknowledged that the war on drugs has failed. UN agencies now discuss harm reduction, human rights, and alternatives to criminalization. International drug policy is no longer a settled question, but a contentious debate, with prohibition increasingly on the defensive. What does the future hold? The trend seems clear. More jurisdictions will likely move toward legalization, or at least decriminalization. Federal prohibition in the United States seems increasingly untenable, though political obstacles remain significant. International treaties will likely be reformed or reinterpreted. Research, long hampered by prohibition, will accelerate, giving us better understanding of cannabis's risks and benefits. The industry will continue to mature with better regulation, quality control, and safety standards. But we shouldn't forget the history. Marijuana prohibition was never primarily about protecting public health. It was about controlling populations, suppressing dissent, and maintaining power structures. The victims of prohibition were disproportionately poor, black and Latino. The costs were enormous. Millions arrested, families destroyed, communities devastated, billions of dollars wasted, and a massive expansion of police and prison power that extended far beyond marijuana. The history of marijuana is the history of how we treat plants, drugs, pleasure, medicine, and each other. It's a story of ancient wisdom and modern hysteria, of medical science and political manipulation, of cultural change and generational conflict. It's about who decides what substances we can use, who profits from those decisions, and who pays the price. From ancient shamans in Central Asia, to Scythian warriors, to Hindu priests, to Chinese emperors, to Victorian doctors, to jazz musicians, to hippies, to medical patients, to today's consumers, humans have been drawn to this plant for thousands of years. We've used it for fiber, food, medicine, spirituality, creativity, and recreation. We've demonized it and celebrated it, banned it and legalized it, lied about it and studied it. The world's most wanted drug is, in the end, just a plant. But its story is our story, reflecting our fears and desires, our wisdom and folly, our capacity for both harm and healing. The drug war against marijuana is ending, slowly and unevenly, but its lessons remain vital. We must remain vigilant against moral panics, resist propaganda that demonizes substances and people, and demand that drug policy be based on science, compassion, and justice rather than fear and prejudice. The complete history of marijuana is still being written. Each jurisdiction that reforms its laws, each person whose record is expunged, each research study that expands our knowledge adds another chapter. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: prohibition failed. It failed to stop people from using marijuana. It failed to protect public health. What it succeeded in doing was causing enormous harm, perpetuating injustice, and wasting resources that could have been used for education, treatment, and genuine public health approaches. As we move forward, we have the opportunity to write a better ending to this story. One based on honest science rather than dishonest propaganda. One that treats drug use as a health issue rather than a moral failing or criminal act. One that repairs the damage done to communities devastated by the war on drugs. One that learns from thousands of years of human experience with this remarkable plant. The history of marijuana teaches us that our relationship with consciousness-altering substances is complex, ancient, and deeply human. It teaches us that prohibition often causes more harm than the drugs it targets. It teaches us that drug policy is never just about drugs, but always about power, race, class, and control. And it teaches us that change is possible, that even policies that seemed permanent and inevitable can be challenged and transformed when enough people demand justice. This is the complete history of marijuana, the world's most wanted drug. From ancient medicine to modern politics, from prohibition to legalization, from demonization to normalization, it's a story that continues to unfold, shaped by science, politics, culture, and the choices we make about how to live together in a free and just society.